Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff, with co-host Eleanor Goldfield. This segment is another one of those where Eleanor and I talk about things happening around the world, things happening in the world of independent media, particularly focusing on stories that the corporate media either don't want to cover at all, or, as Eleanor is going to talk more about, when they do cover it, they have a wild spin and slant, and they leave out important details and context. And that's why independent media is so really important. Eleanor, it's always great to be in conversation with you. I know we're often on our co-hosting duties talking to other folks, but it's always wonderful to talk with you and really to hear your perspectives. And you've got several stories, that have been really important of late. Some stuff from our friends at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, of course, The Intercept. So let's jump into a couple of these stories, and let's talk about the things that the corporate media would rather we not.
Yeah, absolutely, Mickey. And so this is a poll actually that was done of 1,000 people, so not like a massive poll, but still interesting in that little microcosm that mirrors oftentimes the macrocosm. It was a poll done of 1,000 adults, conducted by a group called JL Partners from April 16th through April 18th of this year. So about a month ago. We're recording this on May 16th. And it was paid for by the YouTube-based news network Breaking Points, which is connected to The Intercept. So I'm right now I'm pulling from an article on The Intercept.
Right.
And it shows that cable news viewers, what we call legacy media or corporate media, are more supportive of Israel's war effort, less likely to think Israel is committing war crimes, and less interested in the war in general. People who get their news primarily from social media, YouTube, or podcasts, like y'all listening to this one, for instance, generally side with the Palestinians, believe Israel is committing war crimes and genocide, and consider the issue of significant importance. And we can step into what can be gleaned by this, but basically the ultimate takeaway from this is that if you watch corporate media, you are getting the propagandized Zionist perspective. And I'll also be pulling from a Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting report specifically about the New York Times, which of course is not cable news, but they're part of that, I'd say, the Zionist propaganda conglomerate. And so this basically, those who focus on that kind of news are not seeing what's really going on in Gaza. But as we've talked about on the show before, this is the first genocide in the history of humanity that's actually been able to be live streamed. And that's not live streams that are showing up on CNN or Fox News, right? These are live streams that are showing up on TikTok. Of course, that precipitated the push to shut down TikTok in the US. Or on Instagram, on Twitter, or X, or whatever we're calling it these days. These are things that people are accessing through social media channels and through podcasts like the Project Censored podcast. So that is where people are seeing what used to be called just regular reporting, but now we have to qualify it and call it frontline reporting because reporting is just things that like the corporate news networks purport to do. So.
Yeah, pretty amazing. The article too, in case folks want to follow along, Ryan Grimm piece from The Intercept, cable news viewers have a skewed attitude toward Gaza war, survey finds a tale of two Americas. And, Eleanor, there's granted, now this is taking into account social media. We've seen many efforts over the last couple of years, and this is under a Democratic administration, under the Biden administration. We've seen many efforts by proxy or otherwise to sort of curate, influence, squelch certain kinds of things that happen on social media. And, we've talked at length on this program too about problems of social media, screen addiction, data harvesting. I mean, there's a whole raft of other issues that we talk about, but there's also other reasons that social media has been significant historically, even if it's in its more infancy technologically, is it's often a way to get reports and get things happening, like you say, frontline reporting. It's a way to get information that's happening that doesn't usually make it through the filters of the corporate media or the corporate press. And so, interestingly, our Congress, as our listeners likely know, voted to ban TikTok. Interestingly, in these hearings, they're all talking about how TikTok is horrible and all the things that they do. And all the other things that they're crowing about that are so terrible are all the same things that Instagram or Facebook or Threads or whatever they are. They all have the same issues, but TikTok is owned by a Chinese company, ByteDance. So the US government doesn't seem to have enough proxy influence on it. And gee, a lot of young people seem to be getting information on these platforms that contradict or point out things that the corporate media, the legacy media just aren't getting at, aren't covering, or are trying to play down or deny. And so, look, it just came out recently, and I think you and I maybe even have mentioned this before. Mitt Romney, one of the quote moderate Republicans still around, quote unquote. They openly have talked about how the TikTok ban was because of Gaza. The TikTok ban was directly related to the things people were getting from it because they can't control it. It wasn't long ago that the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal was at the World Economic Forum bemoaning the fact that people were becoming more media literate because, in her words, they couldn't control the narrative anymore. I mean, she's saying this out loud. We see people in Congress saying out loud the reason they're banning it is because of the content. Look, and even if they can skirt First Amendment issues and free press issues, which is an abomination, but we do have legal precedent and prior restraint, and censorship by proxy is a thing, but it's not subject to the same legal regulations. And so what we're seeing right now is, I think, an open hostility towards specific social media outlets based on content. And then, of course, what you just talked about with this article is that the kind of information that people are getting from these different sources does seem to have some role or impact on what their views are about things. And so from a media literacy perspective, we should be merging a lot of these different sources so that people become more aware of what kind of angles and perspectives are coming from where, so people can be kind of in their own driver's seat and they can decide which sources are accurate in speaking to them and so on. And look, we're living in an era of deep fakes and fake news and moral panics. And well, I guess we're also living in an era of, as you said, what looks like a genocide happening in real time before our eyes that the corporate media is dancing around, but the social media platforms and people there are calling it out. It's creating a real crisis, I think, both for legacy media and our so-called democratic institutions, because our quote unquote leaders or quote unquote representatives are basically fretting that they're losing control of the narrative. We have a majority of young people think that what's happening in the Middle East is flat out wrong. And this is a very dire development in an election year when we have the team red, team blue dynamics already afoot. And we have one candidate that's talking about, basically having a full-blown fascistic administration. And we have another one that's kind of fiddling while, the proverbial Rome burns and they're dropping the bombs to light it ablaze. So, Eleanor, we're living in an interesting time. And I think that you're calling attention to this piece in The Intercept is exactly the kind of analysis that we would do here, at Project Censored. And I think it goes again to look at, well, and again, this doesn't mean The Intercept is perfect any more than it means the New York Times always lies. But we have to always say that because people are like, well, you're blinded to this and you don't pay attention to that. Well, help us out, listeners. Send the hate mail. But, again, I think that it's important. And then the other piece, Eleanor, that you're calling attention to, Jim Narakis at FAIR, New York Times not believing in climate change is like believing in is that one of the stories that we were talking about, or was there another FAIR study?
No, there was another one, Mickey, but before we touch on that, I actually wanted to touch on a couple of things that you brought up, which is the election year and the age aspect, because the well, and I want to point out that, as you mentioned, like a truly free press and an independent press would make sure that people can have access to all of these different sources and make up their own minds and have this critical media literacy lens. And something that I found interesting was that just 8% of the people said that they got most of their news from print journalism, and that includes articles online. And I found that interesting because it also highlights that while a lot of people aren't reading these articles, as Ryan Grimm does point out, which I'm glad that he did, news is an ecosystem. And so a lot of people that aren't reading the articles themselves then get them through commentary, like what we're doing now, right? We're reading the articles so you don't necessarily have to, or through other people on YouTube or other podcasts or even other TikTok and Instagram will comment on things that they've themselves read. So this also highlights the fact that what you might be watching, if you're listening to this, you are in fact getting something from print journalism, just not directly. And it shows also the importance of people who take a bunch of stories and then share that via podcast or what have you. But I wanted to get to the age aspect because it showed that in this survey, people age 18 to 29 felt that there was a genocide being committed by Israel. Those over 65, by a 47 to 21% plurality, said Israel is not committing a genocide. And of course, this also goes along with who's more likely to watch cable news versus who's more likely to go, not just primarily, but sometimes only to social media in order to get their news. And so that was a huge, perhaps not that surprising, but because it also aligns, of course, with the college campuses being where so many of these protests are happening, right? They're not happening at assisted living facilities, although I would love to see that. But the grannies for Gaza, if nobody's done that yet, please do. The other thing that kind of went along with that, and I've seen this a lot with even when I was in my late teens, early 20s, was the feeling of the propensity to vote. The feeling that your vote matters in a federal election. I'm not talking about local and things like city council, but on a presidential level, whether it matters. Because the thing is, both candidates are pro-genocide, right? One's actively committing it, and the other one says he would go even further. So you have no candidate, no real candidate that is saying, from the two-party system, that is saying that they would stop it. And so this is also, I think, pushing people to feel that, well, why should I bother voting? And it turns out that print readers and cable viewers were by far more likely to vote. Those who got their news from social media or YouTube were most likely to say that they were definitely not voting or unlikely to. And this speaks to this, not just this critical media literacy that pushes people to see what's actually going on, but then to also dissect and analyze the system that is putting forth quote unquote different candidates that end up being very much the same. And that then catalyzing a sense of feeling that voting is not civic engagement. Voting is not a proper way to engage with trying to change the world around you. Perhaps other ways of activism are like college encampment or something like that. So it's really interesting to see kind of this domino effect that is happening, and also how these things are inextricably linked here, Mickey.
Absolutely, Eleanor. And, but speaking to that issue very briefly, and then I know you wanted to go on and talk about a recent piece at FAIR on how the New York Times was not much concerned about Israel's mass murder of journalists, which is a really dire story. But it's, I also understand the disillusionment, and particularly from young people kind of looking at what's happening and trying to make sense of it. I would suggest and hope that younger people in that category who are maybe feeling this kind of alienation, to remember that, there are areas of difference between the parties when it comes to some issues around the Supreme Court or reproductive rights. And there's a raft of issues where there are some significant differences. And one of the things that I am concerned about as an educator is that because so much of this chaos is afoot, and because there are such low opinion polls about our institutions, including the media, right? I worry that young people who should be hopeful and full of energy and optimistic, I think they're getting turned cynical. And I think that being cynical at a young age is problematic for so many reasons. Being skeptical, and we've talked about this too before, being skeptical and suspicious of our society and our power systems might spur more engagement and watchdogging, as it were. If we're cynical, It just means people kind of maybe tune out and let the grind go on in the direction it's heading, which is not good. And so, I would hope that maybe through independent media and wherever people are accessing it, you said many younger people aren't going to the print per se, but they're learning about stuff through social media. This is why there's a lot of focus on trying to curate or censor social media, because it's a place where it breaks the filters of the corporate system in terms, even though that's big tech, right? It does allow for stories to get through that, the corporate media filters often don't. So I would hope that, for younger folks listening to this kind of program, I hope they would go to read these alternative and independent sources, whether it's the internet or Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. ProjectCensor.org has a huge list of independent sources. And again, people listening to this show know this, but you never know when someone's going to accidentally tune in or roll by the radio dial and hear a conversation that they're not hearing anywhere else on the dial. And so hopefully, young people might take that to heart and realize that becoming more informed might change the way they're engaged. And voting is one way that people are engaged, but there's a lot of other ways that people can be engaged in the system. And of course, Eleanor, you know that so well from your work doing direct action and the other kinds of work that you've done for years. And so I would, again, I would encourage young people to be engaged. We're seeing a lot of that on the college campuses, right? That's an engagement, a significant engagement that I think is hopeful, that people do care, young people are engaged, and that they are not tolerating what the corporate media wants to normalize.
Right.
And that's kind of what we're getting at maybe into the next story, Eleanor. I believe the story that you were talking about, Harry Zenner, is the May 1 piece on the New York Times. And again, and we just saw the press index come out. The United States is down to 55th. Israel was down, I think, to 101. This is just preposterous, that we talk about, these quote free societies, and Israel's the beacon of democracy in the Middle East. By the way, the Economist Democracy Index puts the U.S. as a flawed democracy at 29th and Israel as a flawed democracy at 30th place on their index. Always worth repeating, right? But tell us about this. Tell us about the issue that's been happening, about the way the corporate media is or isn't covering the Committee to Protect Journalists, again, talking about record numbers, horrifically record numbers of journalists being killed in this past year, a majority of them in Gaza. Can you talk about that in the corporate media framing or ignoring of that, Eleanor?
For sure, Mickey. And I want to preface this by saying that the New York Times has several times highlighted journalism is not a crime, with regards not to people like Julian Assange and not to frontline journalists in Gaza, but for instance, Evan Gershkovich, who was detained in Russia, quote, jailed in Putin's Russia for speaking the truth. There was oodles of coverage of this, of course, because evil Russia bad. And so, for instance, this is Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, by the way, found that the Times wrote just 9 articles focused on Israel's killing of specific journalists, and just 2 within, this is like a 6-month span. So I'm not talking about like a few weeks when dozens of journalists have been killed. I'm talking about 6 months here. This just 9 times, and just 2 articles which examined the phenomenon as a whole. Of the 9 headlines which directly noted that journalists have been killed, only 2 headlines, again, in 6 months, named Israel as responsible. So we've talked on the show before, we've had folks like Alan McLeod, who does a lot of work on the use of the passive voice, like, well, these journalists died. Of what? Of tuberculosis? Like, what killed them? This is at best journalistic malpractice, and at worst, of course, it's just propping up the propaganda machine. But so this was oftentimes, both of those headlines, though, that named Israel as responsible, they put it as an accusation, not a fact. So, for instance, this one that I'm looking at here says, from the New York Times on November 21st of last year, Pan Arab News Network says Israeli strike killed 2 of its journalists. Oh, they said so, did they? It's like it, and yet, of course, if it were the IDF saying that something happened, the headline wouldn't say Israeli occupation forces said this. No,
Well,
it
the
would
New York
just be
Times
this
is, I
thing
mean, these
happened.
outlets are running their stories through the Jerusalem Bureau. They're running it through IDF censors.
Right. And I'd like to point out that, like I mentioned, with Evan Gershkovich and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, but also Kurmasheva, two U.S. journalists were being held in Russia. During that same 6-month period, the Times wrote 9 articles. So the same number of articles on 2 journalists as they did about more than 100 journalists that have been killed by Israel in Palestine. The same number of articles. And I'm willing to bet that those articles that were written about these US journalists were very clear on whose fault it was, right? There was no passive voice used there. And also with regards to these articles on the journalists in Palestine, the way that things are framed, even when they talk about blame, talk about fault, it's still skewed. So, for instance, I'll just read this. The As of Friday, this is a November 4th article from the New York Times. 36 news workers, 31 Palestinians, 4 Israelis, and 1 Lebanese have been killed since Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th. So right there, you have these people have been killed since Hamas did this terrible thing. So you're still making sure that people understand, or you're trying to get people to understand that these people would still be alive if it weren't for October 7th, October 7th, October 7th. And so even when you're willing or able to put down the fact that Israel killed these journalists, it's just because of October 7th, right? And the other thing that they do is they blame the war.
Right.
So instead of saying Israel killed someone, it's the war that has killed these journalists. What
What?
war?
Yeah.
And what precipitated it? And
What's
as
the
fairness and
context?
accuracy, right? As fairness and accuracy reporting points out, there's no mention of Israel's long pattern of targeting journalists. And as you pointed out, Mickey, they also have included IDF spokespersons that, of course, say, quote, Israel has never and will never deliberately target journalists. Cool, IDF spokesperson. We'll just take your word for it, shall we?
It's extraordinary, Eleanor. And, the same piece at FAIR, and again, listeners here should certainly know fair.org, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. It also goes in to say this is extraordinary. So I wanted to read it. According to these reports, Israel has killed more journalists in a shorter period of time than any country in modern history. The Times has minimized when not ignoring the mass murder. Conservative estimates from the Committee to Protect Journalists estimate 95 journalists have been killed in the Israel-Gaza conflict since October 7, all but 2 being Palestinian and Lebanese journalists killed by IDF, Israeli Defense Forces. Other estimates from the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate place the number closer to 130. All told, Israel has killed about 1 of every 10 journalists in Gaza, which is a staggering toll. 2 Israeli journalists were killed by Hamas on October 7, according to this study, according to Committee to Protect Journalists. And there were 2 others killed as part of the audience. So again, I'm not pretending that this hasn't affected other journalists, and this is always a tragedy. But is it not clear to you, Eleanor, that this is a very lopsided and skewed affair? I mean, the thing that's striking to me is that killing more reporters in a shorter period of time than any country in modern history, that should be a headline at the New York Times. And then that should trickle over to cable, as you say, right? The print should lead, but the print should lead with the stories that we really need to hear. And like you said, from that other piece, the Ryan Grimm piece, if depending upon where you're getting your news, this is news to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact again that, I mean, it's despicable regardless, but then the fact that the New York Times frequently shares information about these 2 journalists who were detained by Russia over a year ago, talking about how journalism is not a crime and we have to stand up for our journalist buddies and our colleagues. It's like, okay, but I guess only if they're white. I'm having a hard time following your thread here. By the way, Julian Assange is also white, but I guess
That
you know,
doesn't
it's
go
like,
yeah, that doesn't. We have to draw a line somewhere,
right,
Eleanor.
we have to draw a line somewhere. And it's clear that if you are reporting on anything that goes against empire, if you're
There you
reporting on
go.
anything that goes against the Zionist propaganda lie and line, then you are not considered a journalist by the New York Times. And it's just so clear. And it's, again, when you have that critical media lens, it's just so clear that you're being lied to. And when you have that ability to read these headlines, like, you know, that Fair points out, and folks like Alan McLeod, the use of the passive voice, you start seeing it everywhere. And then again, like, the facade really begins to crack. And I think that's that connecting back to that first article, that's clearly what's happened here, is that people, predominantly young people, who are oftentimes told that they don't know anything and, oh, you're just too young, know more than the old people, like, clearly have a better handle on what's actually going on than folks who predominantly or only watch corporate media. And this, of course, goes back to what you pointed out at the beginning, Mickey. It was just, the corporate media does not exist to inform people. It exists to control people and control the narrative, and not teach us how to think, but exactly what to think in service of the system that the status quo.
Yeah, and there's a piece of a part of, exactly, Eleanor, and there's a part of this Fair piece too that says nearly all the journalists who have died in Gaza since October 7 were killed by Israeli airstrikes, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. And as the article at Fair points out, we had to wait until the 11th paragraph of a story on the 116th day of the slaughter for the New York Times to finally publish that admission. So, and the reason I'm pointing this out, and this is important, it's not such that the corporate media never cover the issues or some of these stories. And this is the clever part. They'll eventually, perhaps, maybe, get around to begrudgingly acknowledging something, and they'll totally bury the lead. And if you read the headline suggests one thing, and then you read down the article halfway and you're like, wait a minute, the material in the article seems to contradict the headline, or it says something far more important than the headline implies. Mm-hmm. And this is a way that corporate media frame those stories. And we're back to that issue. And you mentioned that earlier, Eleanor, about how these stories are framed and what's left outside the frame. But also, you know, the folks at the New York Times can just go back and they can say to us, hey, we covered that story on January 30 in the 11th paragraph on day 116 of the slaughter. So we're good.
Right.
We're not censoring it. We're not hiding it. We're reporting it. You're just, you know, there's just a lot to do. So this goes back even to the founding of Project Censored, when Carl Jensen talked about news judgment. That the editors that are making these decisions and the powers that be that are pressuring them to do or do not cover stories, that's the news that doesn't make the news. It's the news about the news that the news never gets around to reporting. And that's where often the devil lies in the details. So that's again, the Fair article is it shines a lot of light on this story. But Eleanor, it's a very ugly and sad story. It's a horrible story about how many people are being killed, not just journalists. I know we've been focusing on that. But look, you know, we even see disputes coming up on the number of dead. And the UN, when they declared that they're, you know, well, wait a minute, we're trying to get an accurate count here. Right-wing media and neoliberal media came all over it. They were like, oh, see, you're overcounting it. It's not that bad. It's not 35,000 people. It's only 20. I mean, I don't understand the logic, but, you know, somehow we're all supposed to kick back, Eleanor, and say like, wow, man, I thought we were on the way to genocide. Fortunately, the sober minds have congregated and stopped it there. This is preposterous. But once again, that's how corporate media framing influenced public opinion. And that's why we need a vibrant, independent, and free press to report these stories, to help analyze these things and get people thinking more critically about the media they consume.
Absolutely, Mickey. And again, I think with regards to that, this also connects to a conversation that we had a while back about New York Times memos that said they weren't allowed to use certain language.
Sure.
And of course, this is, I mean, I've mentioned the passive voice, but language and how we define things is also so important. I mean, when people started calling it the genocide in Gaza, a lot of people got really uncomfortable. And my response was, you should be uncomfortable, because genocide is horrific. No one should be like, okay, cool, genocide. It should make you uncomfortable. And when we read that word, or when we hear it on a podcast or something like that, it should make us stop and take stock and say, okay, whoa, so what is going on here? And that's exactly, of course, why they don't want to use that word. Also because there's this feeling in Zionist propaganda world that the Jews own the word genocide. So it doesn't apply to, the Rwandan genocide or the Armenian, or like it is specifically just for what's known as the Shoah, or the Holocaust of the Jews in World War II. And so it's this like at every turn, how things are phrased, what language, again, like going back to how fairness and accuracy reporting pointed out that when Hamas attacked on October 7th, this happened. It's like, no. Israel killed that. I mean, obviously tens of thousands of people, including over 100 journalists. End of sentence. And it reminds me too, going back to the electoral politics conversation, it reminds me of a debate that I saw back in what I guess it was like 2015 or 2016, where both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders were asked if they were supporters of fracking, and Bernie Sanders' answer was no. And then Hillary Clinton gave like a 5-minute response that was just a bunch of equivocating, and at the end of it, you're like, what are we even talking about anymore? I don't even know what was the question? And it was very reminiscent of this kind of how corporate media spins something, so that you propose a question like, is a genocide happening in Gaza? And then by the end of it, we're talking about something completely different, and you don't know where we are or what the topic was. And it's a very adept way of shifting focus and shifting blame, of course, and ensuring that people don't get the straightforward, honest story from the front lines.
It's so well put, and I think so important for people to really ruminate on, especially the last couple sentences there. I think that it is, again, possible. It is possible that we have dialogue and conversation about these very difficult subjects. But I do think that when we broaden our media sources and we're able to see, again, we're back to the team red and blue thing. And even in that case, they're kind of unilateral. I mean, they're kind of like one mind on what's happening with Israel, which is very problematic in that regard, right? Democrats and Republicans are very pro-Israel and the attacks in Gaza. But I think that if we can get people who do maybe support this, maybe it's a knee-jerk support, maybe they have other reasons for identifying with that support, I think it's important that we're able to get people to understand that just because something is telling a different story or a different perspective doesn't make it fake news. It bothers me to see a lot of the neoliberals or Democrats using the fake news epithet that they coined and that Trump weaponized against some of these other young people in particular on social media, because I think that we need to incorporate those narratives and those perspectives into the bigger picture, because I don't believe that everybody that's cheering this on is doing so because they want to see some kind of genocide. I honestly think some of these people maybe do, but there's a host of other people, I think, that are caught in a misinformation maelstrom. And by that, I don't just mean that they're getting false information potentially. I just mean they're only getting a part of the story, which is more problematic because it leads people to believe, match their confirmation bias, and say, well, the New York Times has been right so far. And hey, by the way, they did say in the 11th paragraph on the 116th day, and so they kind of grasp at the straws to hold on to the blanket, like, the New York Times. And the New York Times does good work on occasion, of course. But it's important to include all of these other narratives from independent media. And it's very important to resist any effort to censor, shut down, or silence these platforms, these sources. Because look, some of the tools that the Democrats are using to control discussion and debate, imagine what somebody else might do who's more authoritarian, right? Just imagine if there might be somebody running for office right now that strangely could even be more authoritarian than the things we're seeing now, Eleanor. I wonder what would happen.
It's hard to imagine because,
Yeah.
Obama creating the largest surveillance state the world's ever seen, and then Trump used it. We have nothing to compare it to, Mickey.
Yeah.
I can't imagine.
Yeah. The latest efforts too on the show that we had, Eleanor, and I know we might be coming up on the end of the hour, top of the hour. But the latest attack has been on nonprofits. And specifically, and Andy Lee Roth at Project Censored wrote a great piece for Truth Out, and Seth Stern, who was on the show last week, did a great piece on The Intercept at The Intercept. Saying, people need to wake up. The Congress is openly passing bills that are targeting, that are going to give the Secretary of the Treasury unilateral authority to revoke 501c3 status from nonprofits by decree without due process. Let that sink in. I know we've talked about this before, but I have to mention it again because Project Censored operates under a nonprofit. The Real News Network operates under a nonprofit. The Intercept operates under a nonprofit. Pacifica, we could go on and on and on here about the nonprofit status of so many independent media outlets. And this is the new tool. This would be the new weapon that allows, of all people, the appointed Secretary of the Treasury. Well, doesn't that make sense, though, huh?
Yeah.
The purse, the money bags, deciding what the nonprofits with no money get to say. But that's what they're doing next. They're coming after the nonprofit news outlets next. And I don't mean to sound alarmist. I'm telling people this because Congress already passed it. They even tried to attach it as a rider on the FAA reauthorization bill, which has nothing to do with airplanes, right?
They love
And
doing
flight.
that.
It didn't go through yet. We're lucky. It didn't make it onto the rider. But I want people to pay attention to what's happening like this in Congress. Don't just write it off cynically as like, it's not for me, or we can't change it. There are a lot of press freedom groups that have been screaming from the rooftops about these things, and we've gained a lot of traction to push back, right? To protect the nonprofit media space, because it's so important to have independent voices from across the spectrum, but it's so important to have voices that are from the bottom up, not the top down.
Yeah, absolutely, Mickey. Very well put. And I guess I'll end this segment with a question for folks to ruminate on. And that is, if censorship is a tool, censorship is a tool. The question is, what is it that is so scary that must be censored and cannot be met in broad daylight and discussed and debated? And I'm letting that question be open-ended. So
yeah, the question of the hour.
yeah,
Yeah,
truly.
Indeed. Yeah, and I think a fantastic question to end on, and perhaps we'll even do a show in the future where we go into more detail or go deeper. Maybe we'll even find some people with different views and perspectives that want to come on and actually have that kind of discussion and debate, where it doesn't just turn into rhetorical tricks and name calling and insults and willful ignorance and willful misconstruing of facts and so forth. I mean, the media can make a difference. The media can help propel meaningful discourse. It just depends if it's for discourse sake, in the public interest, or is it part of a more insidious, nefarious propaganda campaign to keep pretending we have a free press when we may not?
Indeed.
Thanks so much, Eleanor. It's been great talking with you again in this segment of the program. And folks can learn more about the show at projectcensored.org. Eleanor, any other sites or places you'd like to tell people about that you could share with them so they can follow more of your work that you do outside of the program?
Yeah, absolutely. All of my work is at artkillingapathy.com. Mickey, it's always great to get on here and rap with you about the news of the hour that you won't find other places.
Thanks, Eleanor. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll see you next time.